it, but I wanted to welcome all of you to Conflict Styles and Surviving All This Togetherness. So Ronald Reagan said at one point, peace is not the absence of conflict, but it's how we deal with conflict. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, not how to get rid of conflict, but how we deal with conflict when it comes up. And in these crazy times that we're going through right now, I imagine that there is a lot of conflict that's arising in people's lives and their homes and their work, because things are changing and changes cause conflict. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to walk away with today, or what I'm hoping we walk away with today, is we're going to understand 5 different conflict modes and approaches to conflict. As we go through this, we're going to think about our own conflict modes. So as we talk about them and we look at the examples, think about yourself and how you approach conflict. And then we'll talk about some tools to help deal with conflict as we go through it. So I pulled 2 definitions. Any situation in which your concerns or desires differ from those people around you. So concerns or desires and differ. So disagreement, things are different, or a mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, and wishes. So those are the five words I think that we can focus on: needs, drives, wishes, concerns or desires, and how they differ from other people. So when we think about conflict in this context, we're going to think about it between 2 different people, us and somebody else. I know that there's conflict between nations and states and political parties. We're not talking about those today, although this could probably relate to all of that. We're going to talk about it one-on-one so that we can have some actionable ways to deal with conflict. So we're going to talk about the conflict modes. So these conflict modes I'm talking about come from the Thomas Kilmann instrument, and this is an assessment that you can take. We're not taking it today because we're just going to talk about it and describe it and see it in ourselves. If you ever want to take it, you can let me know, but it's not necessary. Hopefully you'll be able to see yourself in this. But what this Thomas Kilmann instrument of conflict modes looks at, it's how you behave in a conflict situation. And it looks at it in 2 dimensions. So it looks at it first on the left, you'll see assertiveness. So how assertive are you? Meaning how much do you take care of your interests and sacrifice somebody else's interests? And on the cooperative line on the bottom, how cooperative are you, or how do you take care of somebody else's interests at the expense of your own interests? So that's what we're going to look at. So those 2 dimensions, and then all of the modes within those dimensions. So here are the 5 conflict handling modes that we're going to be talking about today: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And we're going to look at each one of these. So you can see where they are in the spectrum. None of them are good or bad. They all are just different modes, and they all have their purpose in dealing with some kind of conflict. But what happens is we tend to use 1 or more, maybe 2 of the modes as our dominant modes. So we may lean on one of those more than any of the others, and then we use them in all of our conflict situations. And then that's where problems arise, because they might not be the right mode to solve that particular conflict. So we'll look at, as we go through this, I want you to think about, where do I see myself in this mode? Is this something that I either do too much, too little? And when is the right time to use this mode? So that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through this. And we're going to start with the competing mode, because this one on the scale is high on assertiveness and low on cooperation, meaning these folks are in a power-oriented mode. They're thinking of themselves first and trying to get their needs met first. My way or the highway is a good way to describe them. They might be social activists where they're standing up for rights for people, defending a position, or just trying to win. Some people just like to win, and so they may lean on this mode too much. So here are some skills that somebody who is in a competing dominant mode might be showing. But they're good at arguing, they don't give up. But the times where this competing mode is good are in an emergency situation where a quick decision has to be made. This is when you want a competing mode dominant person to stand up and make a decision, because they're not going to be afraid. They're going to be confident in their decision, and they're going to get in there and make that decision. Also, when an important issue comes up, but the resolution is going to be unpopular. So somebody who is in a competing mode might not be afraid to go in and make a difficult decision and stand up for it. The other time this might be a good skill to use is when you're trying to protect yourself around somebody who is taking advantage of you. Leaning on the competing skills will help you protect yourself and stand up for yourself. So if you overuse competing skills, this might point to that this is your dominant mode. So some questions you can ask yourself if you're overusing the competing skills: are you surrounded by yes people? Does everybody always just say yes to you? Then you might be a competing mode person. Are people afraid to admit ignorance or uncertainty around you? They don't like to talk to you if they're not confident in their position. Then you might be showing up as a competing person, a competing mode person. So you can also underuse this skill. So there may be times when you should be using it and you're not using it. And you might recognize this in yourself if you're feeling powerless, if you feel uncomfortable when you're using it, or if you have trouble taking a firm stand, then you might recognize that you're not using this mode enough for you. The next mode is accommodating. So this is completely opposite from competing. So these are the people who are on the high cooperative scale, meaning they'll sacrifice their own needs for the needs of somebody else, and they're low on the assertive scale. So they're not fighting for themselves, they're just taking care of other people. So opposite of competing. And that you might describe them as self-sacrificing. They probably are generous and do a lot of charity, so they're constantly out helping other people. And they might be described as compliant or obedient. They do what they're told to do, and they don't really question it because it's important for them to make sure other people are getting their needs met versus their own needs. So here are some skills for the accommodating mode, but let's talk about when these might be important. So somebody might use the accommodating skill if the issue is more important to the other person than it is to them, and they're just willing to yield it. Sometimes they want to make sure that they give a goodwill gesture, especially if they're trying to maintain or increase a relationship with somebody. They might use the accommodating skill to give that goodwill and maintain the relationship. There might be times where that a disruption due to a conflict is not worth it, and it's important to keep the harmony. So if something's going on in your world, if you're studying for a test or you're really trying to focus on something, and a disruption because of a conflict is going to cause a problem in that flow, accommodating for a short term might be a good solution in order to keep the harmony going or keep the flow going. So if you're overusing it, this might be your dominant style. So you can ask yourself, do your ideas not get the attention they deserve sometimes? Or, this is a good one, is discipline lax on your team or in your house? So somebody who's high in accommodating might get taken advantage of because people know that they'll yield or that they can take advantage of them. And so sometimes discipline might get lax because the person that's in charge of discipline, if they're accommodating, might let that go a little bit. The underuse of accommodating, if you're not using this enough, you know, you might think about it as the opposite. You're back to competing. So if you're moved back into that competing mode, you might have trouble building goodwill, and you might need to pull on accommodating a little bit more. If people describe you as being unreasonable, then you might not be accommodating in certain situations enough when you could accommodate. Do you have trouble admitting when you're wrong? Or you can't recognize legitimate exceptions to the rule. So if there's an exception to the rule that is not that big of a deal, but you still won't relent on it, you might underuse accommodating. The next one is avoiding. So avoiding is on the bottom. So you're uncooperative and you're unassertive. So you're, this would be considered the, I'll think about it tomorrow people. They don't address conflict. They don't address it immediately anyway. They might be diplomatic, as some people might describe them. They sidestep to avoid the situation, and they might postpone for a better time. So sometimes when you might want to use avoiding skills is on an unimportant issue, or if there's more important issues you need to deal with and this is not an important issue, then you might just want to avoid the situation. If you know you're powerless in the situation and that status isn't going to change, then that might be a time where you might just avoid the conflict as well. If the cost outweighs the benefits of getting into this conflict, avoiding it for a short term may be the solution. And then oftentimes in conflict, the emotions will run high, right? So people get upset, and so sometimes at that moment, avoiding the conflict is the right thing to do to allow people to calm down, get in a better headspace so that the conversation can continue. So let's talk about if you're overusing avoiding, because this might be your dominant skill. So think about this and ask yourself these questions. Do people have a hard time getting your input? Do you, when people ask, do you not respond to their input? You just ignore it? Do people sometimes walk on eggshells around you because they're afraid that you're just going to ignore them? Or are decisions made on important issues by default? So you just decide not to make an issue, so it just gets made by default by not making the issue at all. So those might be some questions you can ask yourself to see if avoiding is your dominant mode. So if you're underusing avoiding, are you hurting people's feelings? So in certain situations, it may be okay to avoid so that you don't hurt people's feelings. So if you're stirring up hostilities and hurting people's feelings, you might not be using avoiding at the right times. And are you feeling overwhelmed by issues? So if you're trying to take on everything and trying to solve all conflicts and all issues, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You need to decide which are the ones that are important, which ones can I put off, which ones can I wait till later. And that's when you would use avoiding. All right, collaborating. So this one is high on assertive and high on cooperative. So you're trying to work together to get a win-win solution. And you're digging in, you're talking, you're listening, you're creating creative solutions on interpersonal issues. You're really trying to work together to get things done. The time when this is important is when the concerns of both people are too important to compromise. So they both, whatever's important to them, they both feel very strongly about it and they don't want to compromise. So collaborating is a good time to do that. when it's important to look at the other person's point of view, that's when collaborating is important, because you're talking and you're listening and you're trying to understand the other person's point of view so you can come to a solution. When you're bringing together ideas, and also when you're trying to gain commitment. So if you think about the tasks that are happening or the processes that are happening, it's important to gain people's commitment so that they'll actually do it. And one way to do that is to collaborate and listen to their ideas, incorporate their ideas, and make sure that everybody feels like they have a way to contribute to the solution. So if you are overusing collaborating, do you ask yourself, do you spend too much time discussing issues? Are you one of those people who every time something comes up, you say, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about the laundry. We need to talk about unloading the dishwasher. How do you feel about that? It doesn't have to be used on everything, and you don't have to talk about it for every complex situation. But if you do use this as your dominating mode, other people might feel it that way. If they stop wanting to collaborate with you, you might be doing it too much. If you underuse collaborating, then you're probably asking yourself, is it difficult to see the differences in other people's points of view? So you're not asking, you're not talking, you're not listening. So you're not really trying to see things from other people's point of view. So that's when collaborating might help you a little bit more if you need to do that. Are people not committing to the decisions that you're making? If you're making decisions and people aren't committing to them, then they may not feel like their point of view has been heard. So collaborating might not have been the solution you used to get there. Okay, the last one's the one right in the middle, and this is compromising, and this is the let's make a deal. And so some people would say this is the lose-lose, but it's really the I give a little, you give a little, and we come up with a solution together. Some sort of middle of the road, exchanging concessions kind of solution.
Well, get them running. Kick the ball around.
The times where you would use a compromising skills are when the goals are moderately important and it's not worth the effort to collaborate or to accommodate, meaning it's not worth the effort to go all the way to the far end of the accommodating or consideration side of the scale. Also, a time where you would use this is when two people have equal power in the situation, but they both have different goals. So they are equally powered, but they have different goals. So in order to reach those goals, they both might have to give up a little bit and concede a little bit. It could also be used for a temporary settlement for a very complex issue, or if you've already tried collaborating, or if you've already tried competing and those haven't worked, you could try compromising in that situation when it's complex and you have tried everything else. So if you're overusing compromising, you might notice that you're not looking at the big picture, that you're worried more about the negotiation and the getting the deal, and you're losing sight of the big picture. Also, you might notice that people become cynical on your team or your family because of the gamesmanship that's going on. Everybody's trying to, if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. So people can become cynical in that situation. And then if you're underusing it, then sometimes you can feel uncomfortable with the negotiating. Not everybody likes the negotiating part. If you ever go to the car dealership and you go in and you have to negotiate a price for a new car, not everybody likes that. Some people love it. But if you're uncomfortable with that negotiation and trying to come up with a compromise, then you might be underusing it. Or if you don't want to give anything up, if you have a hard time giving any concessions, then you might be underusing compromise at the right times.